In 1996, Robert Young Pelton decided to pioneer a new sort of tourism, which is to say, travel to the world's most dangerous places, the world's most toxic places. And so he came in the year 2000, our very first year, to tell us a little bit about what it's like to hunt down terrorists, to hang out with people who are most wanted, to seek out the lawless and crazy spots in the world, and to survive many wars. You wouldn't think it reading the papers this week, listening and watching the news, but he complains that the world is running out of wars. His quote is, "People don't believe me, but there aren't wars anymore. The dangerous countries in the world are down to 12 from 26. Robert Young Pelton. A little more gray in you, Robert.
Yeah, well, it's been a while, 14 years. And you're mean, you put my younger picture in there, so. Never have a publicity picture that's better looking than you are, that's all I can say. I have a quick film to play for you, give you a taste of where I go and what I do.
I want a hat. I want a hat.
That's what I do for a living. Those are scenes and places that I visited, and I guess my goal is to show people what you really don't want to see, what's really happening behind enemy lines, with troops, with mercenaries, with jihadis, with pirates. And it's something I didn't get into as a job. As they say, it's an adventure. But I should tell you that I come from Edmonton, and Edmonton is a good place to come from. So I used to escape on my bicycle, and the police would catch me and take me home when I was young. I had an early love for things beyond the horizon. And I don't know what it is about me, because this is not really about me, it's about the people who enjoy what I do. But at age 58, what I've noticed is we're losing the love of risk. We are letting fear prevent us from doing the things that make us great. Now, Wade did a spectacular job of introducing you to some people who still exist, but there are fewer and fewer people that tell their stories. When I was young, I was a smart kid, I was a poor kid. The first thing I did with my brain was challenge the nuns when they taught catechism, so I was thrown out of school. I ended up in the library reading books, and after I graduated from grade 9, when I was 9 years old, they figured I was either going to go straight to jail or to university. So they sent me to a school called St. John's Cathedral Boys' School. It was a school based out of Winnipeg that was famous for two things: killing 12 of the students and one teacher in a canoe trip, and bringing back a 13-year-old from the dead who'd been frozen for 8 years. But I did study Latin, and I did raise pigs. But none of these things prepared me for what I wanted to do. So I ended up in high school in Victoria. I actually flowered in high school, and my reward for flowering was I got thrown out of the house at age 16. So I did what everybody does. I bought a 1963 Rambler station wagon, and I lived in it. And I picked fruit in the Okanagan, and when people asked me what I was doing at age 16, living in a pink station wagon, I said I was traveling. And I didn't really think much of it, but I kind of enjoyed that. It was sort of very John Steinbeckian. And But after a while, you realize that you have to do something. So I had taken an aptitude test in school that said I was only good for 3 things. Astronaut, which as a Canadian back then wasn't much of a job. Advertising man, which I didn't quite know what that was. And adventurer, which is even less of a job than astronaut back then. So I went to Toronto. I worked very hard. I started in the mailroom. A number of mentors helped me. One of them was Bob McAleer, who worked for BBDO, a big agency. And when I first went for that job, they said, you should be a copywriter because you're very creative and you can write. I had no training. So I said, make me a copywriter. And they said, no, you have to have experience. So I said, how do you get experience? Is well, you start in the mailroom. So I went down to the mailroom and they say, well, do you have any experience in the mailroom? And I said, no. So I then had to work for Merrill Lynch to get experience in the mailroom, to then get a job in the mailroom at BBDO, to then become a copywriter. So Bob McAleer, who I think he had a master's in theology, which is kind of odd for advertising, and I would sit late at night, and Bob would tell me, he was about 55, a wonderful man, a devout Roman Catholic, would tell me about when he was 19, he was like me, and he started working, and there he was at 55, still working. He had never actually done anything. And his biggest problem with me was that I was a kid. I didn't know anything. I didn't know who I was writing for. I didn't know the products. And he suggested I take a leave of absence. And it stuck in me, this yearning for experience. And I then left. I came back. I was then told that Bob had died. And I said, what happened? He said, well, after you left, he left his wife. He moved to Spain. He bought a beret, put an earring in, bought a monkey, and wrote poetry at a cafe. He did that for a few months, and then he came back, got together with his wife, and had a heart attack, and died. And I realized I did more good for Bob than I did for me. So that stuck in my mind, and I became very successful in advertising and marketing. I worked with Steve Jobs on the launch of the Lisa and the Macintosh. I worked for Marvel, Lucas, all these different groups. And I became a millionaire by the age of 31. I wanted to be 30, but 31. And I worked all the time. My last job was I was paid $500,000 a year just to answer the phone for Marvel. And I didn't like doing that. And one day I was doing a show in Monte Carlo, and I'd been up all night at Jimmy Z's, and I didn't like that whole Monte Carlo thing, and I woke up and I could smell Africa as the sun was coming up. And I called my wife and I said, I'm going to Africa. And I simply went to Africa, and I lived with the Dogon people in the middle of the Sahara, and I enjoyed it. And when I got back, I realized I'd made all this money for people doing various dull and boring things. Why wouldn't I just do what I did and make myself the product? So I became that guy. And I was very intrigued with why people didn't go to certain places. So I'd done expeditions, but the journalists used to make fun of me and say, well, yeah, but try going to Algeria, try going to Afghanistan, try going here. So I thought, well, I'll just do that. I'll just go to these places that nobody wants to go to, and I'll meet these people, and I'll set up interviews. So my first trip was to Algeria. Algeria had the Triangle of Death. I stayed with all the Russian hookers in one hotel, and there were about 200 journalists in the other hotel. And they were all being chaperoned around and being shown what was going on in Algeria during the election. I went out to the Triangle of Death with a cab driver who was very nervous, and found out that the people were not afraid of the Islamic fundamentalists, they were afraid of the government. And I was quickly arrested by the government for asking questions in the Triangle of Death, which I guess I learned is not a good thing. But I learned that people were afraid. They were afraid to go out and do these things. And I didn't necessarily have a job or a reason to do this. I was just intrigued. I was writing a book called The World's Most Dangerous Places. Second time is somebody said, well, try to find the Taliban. So I actually went out, and I was with the Taliban in 1996. And I went out in the front lines, and we were being shelled. And the Talibs are funny people. They're very low-key, and when the shells come in, they just kind of sit there. And I'd say, well, don't you think we should, like, duck down or dig a hole or do something like that? And they said, no, Allah will protect us. And I'm like, well, I don't know about your Allah, but I don't know if mine's quite right with what I'm doing here. And he said, well, if you didn't come here to die, why are you here? Now, that's a life lesson there, because I suddenly realized this was the end sum total of these people's existence. They believed in what they were doing, and they were willing to die for it. And I went to another place called Chechnya. I was there in 1999, 2000, just before I came here for the first idea city. And I took a crazy jihadi who was on drugs and a young journalist who wanted to be a journalist, a war correspondent. We went into Grozny. There was no one else there. We were with the Chechen rebels, and the Russians were pulverizing their own people, like Russians, not Chechens. And we were in this town trying to report out via satellite phones, and we got rocketed every time we used the phone. And the media didn't want to write the story because they said, well, how'd you get in there? I said, well, we came with the rebels. Well, then you must be biased. And I'm like, no, we're trying to tell you what's going on. So what happens is the Russians surrounded us, and they do a pincer movement, and the commander that we were with said, you have to leave. And I said, but I want to stay. He said, no, you have to leave because the Russians will mess with you. And I said, okay. So as we get in this car and as the clock's ticking down, he says, wait. He said, you know, the problem with this place is that they don't dance enough. So before we left, he had to do this little dance, this very joyous dance, knowing that he was going to die. And I thought, wow, I have to stop hanging out with people who want to die. So I came back, and I became famous for not being dead. You know, I was the guy that did all the interviews, and I said, what about the Chechen people? There's old ladies there, there's children there, whatever. And I sort of became this sort of quasi-celebrity. And I didn't like that because I really wanted people to focus on the hosts. So I thought what I'll do is I'll work as a journalist. So in 2001, I had an invitation to the war with General Dostum, and I was with a group of special forces soldiers who fought on horseback. And I was there for Kelly Jangi and all the fighting, and I interviewed a guy named John Walker Lind, and who I just went, he was obviously now the second Irish-American jihadi I'd been with, and I was more concerned about his welfare, so I interviewed him, took him back to my house where I was staying so he wouldn't get killed, and he disappeared. So suddenly I became famous for the guy that interviewed John Walker Lind, not for the 450 guys that were murdered and killed in the fortress. 2003, Iraq War. They're fighting over who wants to hire me. So I decided to go with ABC Investigative. They want me to find weapons of mass destruction. I don't think there are weapons of mass destruction. So I work as a journalist, and I find it's an extremely isolating experience. As a matter of fact, so much so that I am the only journalist who was embedded with journalists for a month in the opening of the Iraq War because they wouldn't let me sneak into the country with my special forces friends. So then I quit, and I went to work for CBS 60 Minutes. And it was the same thing. You know, we looked all over for weapons of mass destruction. There were no weapons of mass destruction, so they wouldn't run that story. Instead, what I found were mass graves. I then felt so strongly about these mass graves that I said, I want to do a story. And they say, no, we don't think that's a good story. So I quit. I bought a red Bentley that Uday used to own, and I drove around the countryside documenting mass graves. And for the first time, I realized how little we knew about the war. We were reading stories of embedded reporters, you know, we were cheering the troops going in there, but we never saw what it was like for the Iraqis. And I then decided that I would get real. And I created ground networks. I hired 700 Iraqis in all these little towns to report on what was going on inside their towns, and I made a lot of money selling that information to the US military and the State Department and the CIA, who were actually there, just couldn't get out and meet these people. So I kept thinking, why are we not communicating? Why are we not getting the root causes of these wars? And it literally took 8 years for the US military to figure out how Iraq works. And if you know what's happening now with ISIS and the Sunnis versus Shias, it's the exact same thing. It's the tribes are angry at the Shias, so they're causing a ruckus. But it took us, America, 8 years to figure that out. So I then thought, okay, Afghanistan, that's a tough one. I had 1,200 people working for me in Afghanistan, in the Pakistan tribal areas and the area that were in conflict in Afghanistan. I then had these people report on what was going on, and then I realized we have the same problem with the military. So I would invite Taliban commanders to come into Kabul with one-star generals, and I had a friend who had an Italian restaurant in Kabul, and we would have the Taliban sit with the generals, and they would say, why are we fighting you? Why are we angry? You know, usually because corruption or some minor conflict. And suddenly the war became very simple for the commanders. This was so successful that I found myself on the front page of the New York Times as a covert assassin, ninja, whatever, because the CIA found out that we were actually pacifying certain regions of the country because, like two fighting kids, we sort of put them in the same room and they stopped fighting. So I then decided, you know, the heck with that, I'm going to go fight pirates. So I then started tracking 460 kidnapped people and a very large number of ships that nobody seemed to care about. And I worked with a group of very odd people, South African mercenaries, wealthy American financiers, and there's no pirates anymore. And the point is that I would go into places that people were afraid to go into, and I would typically find that people were saying, why are you afraid to come here? We have very real things we want to tell you. We have reasons for doing what we're doing. And I was reading the newspaper yesterday, and I noticed that the American Psychology Association said that the age group that has the highest amount of stress are young people, and that they're stressed out about everything, life, job, money, whatever. And all I can do as a mentor now, I'm 58, so I'm the guy with the gray hair that tells you, don't do that or do that, is that these poor people are terrified of going out into the world without a return ticket, without a guarantee, without an insurance policy, and trying to figure out how life works, because that's what makes them afraid. They really don't understand why criminals live here, why car accidents happen over there. And my goal is to reach out to young people. So to wrap up, the Vice magazine, which is sort of an irritating hip magazine that's very popular, asked me to go to South Sudan. And I went into South Sudan with no return ticket. I had to pay $17,000 to convince a pilot to drop me in rebel territory. I hunted down a warlord who was hiding. I was with the White Army, which is 30,000 crazed Africans with spears, machine guns, killing people. I filmed it. You can see it on YouTube if you type in my name and Saving South Sudan. And then I wrote an entire issue. For the first time in 21 years, I wrote 60,000 words in 2 weeks. And the most welcome thing I got was young people understanding something, reading the entire issue, all 130 pages, front to back, the entire history of our involvement, white people's involvement in Africa, history of South Sudan, cyclical, examples of warfare, and then watching a very gut-wrenching 30-minute documentary, which is essentially this kind of white guy walking around with people getting killed, interviewing people in the middle of a battle, not focusing on the gore so much, but on why people are doing what they're doing. And I'm very happy to say that for the first time, I saw young people get it. What is warfare? On the other side, though, I did 5 weeks of missions with Special Forces soldiers in Afghanistan last year. And they're big fans of mine. They wear my logo. And I thought, okay, here we go. I get dressed up like G.I. Joe, and we're going to go kick some butt. I found out, in order for the Special Forces, they're the best of the best, they had to write 68-page PowerPoints to get out of the fob. And that means for the world's best soldiers to go outside of an enclosure to go rescue, kill, whatever, requires a 68-page PowerPoint. And if you wonder why we don't win wars, if you wonder why people are terrified of going outside of their door and what's out there, that's the kind of society we're in. So here's a couple of things to leave you with. Never confuse what you're afraid of with what can kill you. The most dangerous animal in the world is a mosquito. More people get killed in America by deer than sharks. Secondly, if you fear failure, you've already lost. So never fear failure. Thank you very much.
Robert, you look the very model of a stockbroker, a rather prosperous.
Okay, well, I have to tell you, first of all, I always tried to blend in with the natives. So I looked in books
I think
and I studied.
that's a compliment.
Yeah. And so I bought a tie and a suit so people can't notice me.
I want to ask you one question.
Sure.
I understand your motive, as you've described it, is you go where the journalists don't go.
Right.
And your motive in that case is public enlightenment. But surely, because you keep going back, you must like the risk.
No, there are two kinds of people in the world. When you hear a fire alarm or you see a fire, there are people who run into the building and there's people that run out. I just genetically am the guy that runs into the building. But it's not about that. It's when you get to these places and you see the women and the children and you understand the kind of violence and depredation and things they're going through, you cannot stay there. You can't. I had people cheering me in Grozny because I was documenting bombs falling on them. I just have to say that what motivates me is I feel whole. I feel I'm using all my skills, all my talents to help other people understand what's going on in these places. I don't ask them to judge or make decisions. I just want you to communicate. And secondly, I've spawned God knows how many war correspondents, foreign service officers, military people who said, I was going to be a stockbroker, but now I buy coffee in Liberia. So I'm happy that that's been a big part of my whole career. So.
Do you believe in odds?
No, I've never gambled because I always lose. I know I will die. I don't know when and how, but I'm going to have a hell of a good time until I find that out.
Words to live by.
Thank you.